sanctity of human life has been a major issue in my generation. It's often been in the context, though, of dealing with the unborn being wrongfully killed, having their lives taken from them. And in states like New York are clearly moving in the wrong direction in that regard. But we're also seeing an attack dealing with people having their life support taken from them when they're not dead. They're still alive. We're going to talk about a very important case involving a toddler that we have taken before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. We're going to talk about this case in the second segment. But the first half of the show, we're really fortunate to have with us on the show someone who I have the highest respect for, former U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Glad to be with you and with your listeners.
Now, folks, for those who may not be as familiar with you, maybe the younger generation, I want them to understand some of your background, Mr. Meese. You were with the Reagan administration, actually, when he was governor of California, and you served there in his administration. I think it was chief of staff or attorney general, correct?
Yes, I was with Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California, first as his legal affairs secretary, and then as the chief of staff in the governor's office. And then in the White House, I served as counselor to the president, his chief policy advisor, and then in the first term, and in the second term, I was the Attorney General of the United States. It's a great honor and pleasure to have had the privilege of actually working under the leadership of Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, you were a huge blessing to his administration, and one thing I really admire about you, Mr. Meese, is the fact that you don't just do your time and then just retire per se. You have been actively engaged and involved in policies and forums, and now, in fact, you're serving to this day as chairman of the advisory board for the Pacific Justice Institute. So we have been from the beginning, and I just really appreciate that. I remember when I called to ask you, and I thought, he's not even going to remember me. And you said yes, unequivocally, yes, I'd be happy to serve as chairman of the advisory board of Pacific Justice. And I really appreciate the value you've been to our legal ministry and the work that we do as well. There's so many awards you've received, recognitions. I would take up the whole time. So I'm not going to do that because I think it's so much more valuable to talk about the issues and where we are and where we've come. Now, in the Reagan administration, you were involved, you were the attorney general, you were dealing with legal issues. I want to ask you right up front about how you think things have progressed or digressed with regards to the Department of Justice, the FBI, and specifically the IRS, for example, classic example. They went to war against organizations that had religious or political beliefs and values that they didn't like. This was during the Obama administration, and nothing happened. They weren't prosecuted. No one was fired because of it. And that just seems like that was the first example I can think of the court moving in the wrong direction. What are your thoughts? Am I seeing this correctly, or do we have a major growing mistrust and corruption, if you will, in government in this regards?
Well, I think in terms of government, we have to distinguish between government and then others outside of government, because during the Obama administration, unfortunately, there was a great hostility and wrong actions by government at the same time as anti-Christian people on the outside were also waging war against Christians and Christian organizations and churches. So you mentioned particularly the government, and it was very unfortunate the way in which no action was taken against IRS, actually corrupt use of the IRS to literally persecute organizations that were constitutionally oriented or religiously oriented during that period of time. Fortunately, we have a very different approach by the current administration, where the president gave an executive order protecting religious liberty, and that was very carefully followed and very skillfully and effectively promulgated as a policy of this administration by Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, who issued the regulations and set in motion activities by the Justice Department to correct what had been done in the previous administration.
Yeah, I have to admit, in the last 2 years, I haven't seen the bullying and attacks from the IRS against ministries and churches and Christian organizations like I did prior to that. I know we at Pacific Justice Institute, we received a letter saying that we hadn't turned in our 990, so we owed $5,000 penalty to the IRS. We had it filed electronically to make sure that wouldn't happen because we knew of the corruption that was taking place at the time. 9 months later, we got another letter from the IRS alleging we hadn't refiled for the year prior to that, saying we owed a $50,000 penalty. They weren't backing down, and then finally they sent us a letter saying, "Oh, yeah, we found out we made a mistake. Yeah, we do have them actually. Yeah." And that's only because we stood up to them and we were going to be bringing them into court. But that is the kind of outrageous corruption that we saw. And yet people still, I think, to some degree, are still discouraged about some of the shenanigans they see taking place. Like, for example, with the FBI, they're supposed to be neutral. I always think of them as being, neutral, the law. We're a nation of laws, equal justice for equally applied. But I think a lot of people have a different perspective of the FBI and what they've seen and what's taken place. Is that skepticism justified, do you believe?
Well, I think for the most part the answer is no. I don't think it's justified. I think the FBI today and the Justice Department generally under the leadership of President Trump has a very different approach to these kinds of matters. Now, there may still be some isolated situations because there were people that at the top of the FBI who were very corrupt during the last administration. Most of those have been weeded out now, so I can't say that it's always hard to know whether there might be exceptions, but I think the Justice Department is really under new leadership and continues to be under new leadership with the appointment or the nomination, soon to be the appointment of Bill Barr, who's an excellent man. So I think the correction is already in place, but there may still be some instances, and those are the kinds of things that we have to be very wary of.
Okay, now let me ask you. That's really assuring to hear that. I'm glad you made that really clear. But what about actions recently that I've never heard of? I used to work for U.S. Senator Phil Gramm in Washington, and there was some degree of respect for the system of laws and the branches of government and how things carry out. And yet we had a direct threat to have the State of the Union speech at least postponed and not allowed to for the president to address both houses of Congress in the chamber as is customary. Do you think that is just a blip of just like a one-time thing, or do you think we see a less of respect for the branches of government and the carrying out and respect for the branches of government pursuant to the Constitution? What's your take on this?
Well, I think that I hope it was a one-time only event, but I must say that this is one of the most flagrant examples of a leader of a political party violating the Constitution that we've had in a long time. I don't think there's ever been a time when a president who sought to address Congress and both houses of Congress has been refused to have that opportunity. And it certainly is in contradiction of the Constitution, which actually commands the president to provide a message to the Congress and to report on the State of the Union. Now, it's true that some presidents have done it in writing, different presidents have done it in slightly different ways, but the idea that the Speaker of the House would refuse the president the opportunity to appear before a joint session of Congress is unprecedented, very anti-constitutional, and also I think it indicates a lack of respect for the office and an embarrassment to the Congress when the Speaker did that.
Yeah, and hopefully we won't see that happen again, and hopefully I think both sides of the aisle could hopefully learn from this moving forward, never to consider that in the future, and that's my hope. What about the cases that you see taking place that are dealing with, like, for example, there's the Baker case that it's still sort of up in the air, where he was told that he had to make a cake for a same-sex wedding that violated his religious beliefs. We have other examples where people of faith in the workplace. We at Pacific Justice Institute have a case where a man's being prosecuted because he had a Bible study during work hours, voluntary Bible study during work hours. He's being sued and taken on by a disgruntled employee. And what do you see in terms of the lack of respect for the First Amendment's free exercise clause of religion? Is that a growing concern? Do you see a trend, or do you see these as just isolated instances?
I wish it was just isolated instances, but I think you have a concerted campaign among a number of left-wing organizations and anti-constitutional organizations to persecute Christians, to try to drive any religious aspect out of the public square, which of course is totally contrary to what the founders had in mind when they drew up the Constitution. The whole idea of one of the principal purposes of the Constitution was to protect religious liberty. And so you have these cases where, particularly unfortunately, it's people who are apologists for the homosexuals who are perhaps some of the worst offenders in this regard. But the idea that those people who seek tolerance themselves for their conduct and their type of beliefs are absolutely refused to give that same acceptance or tolerance to anyone else who wanted to exercise their own conscientious beliefs as far as their religious views. So I think right now the First Amendment provision for religious liberty is under greater jeopardy than it has been in the history of our country.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I know right now we at Pacific Justice Institute, our cases have increased dramatically last year from 16 cases in active litigation to now to almost 40 cases in active litigation. They're increasing all across the United States. And I think a lot of it is this attitude of disrespect for religious freedom and mutual tolerance. True tolerance goes both ways. And we want mutual respect for everyone, from the left and the right, from the Christian, from the non-Christian. But unfortunately, that's not everyone's opinion, and it's manifesting itself in a lot of egregious ways. We just have a church that we just defended that was having a property tax levied against it in the San Francisco Bay Area in San Rafael. We won that case. It's going to be probably up on appeal now. But we're busier than ever before, and I just want to thank you, Attorney General Ed Meese, for your work and service to this country, your continued service with the Pacific Justice Institute as chairman of our honorary chairman of our advisory board. And any last comments?
Well, I just want to commend you, Brad, and all the work you and your colleagues have done, the way in which you've been able to expand your efforts, particularly in other states beyond California, on the Pacific Coast, and the way in which you have been adamant in protecting the First Amendment and providing support to people who, many of them being attacked as they are, sometimes by governments, sometimes by other outside organizations, the way in which they're now able to stand up and exercise their religious freedom because of the work that you're doing. I commend you, and I commend the organization, Pacific Justice Institute.
Well, thank you very much, and God bless you and the work that you're doing with the Heritage Foundation and other organizations. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the huge blessing you've been and are continuing to be to serve so many for the sake of our nation and for religious freedom. God bless you, and thanks again for being on the program.
Thank you.